All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of O365A. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about Microsoft Teams governance and how to manage it. So, Curtis, why don't you lead us off?
All right, thanks, Abib. So, Teams governance, it helps to define what we mean by governance. And in the general context, it means all the settings and configuration used to manage access to the application, both internal and external, and features within the application, and more importantly, the data within the application. So, Teams is obviously a collaboration application, and it's really important to think about who has access to all the different teams inside of Teams and the data. And more importantly, it's really important to make sure that the access to the application and to the data meets your organizational needs in terms of data retention. Some companies are highly regulated and need to retain data for a certain period. Other companies, for their legal requirements, need to delete that data after a certain period of time. So in this podcast, we're going to talk about really high level what your options are in terms of governing access to Teams and some of the options available for managing the data within Teams. So Habib, why don't you kick us off and just give us a high level on what configuration settings are available in the Teams tenant?
Yeah, so I mean, from a configuration perspective, you have a few different options or a few different areas in which you perform the configurations. So primarily, Teams automatically comes with these default settings, which Microsoft, has it sort of in like a sweet spot where they may actually fit into most organizations and they might utilize that functionality. Obviously, in different organizations and larger ones, you may want some different default functionality from a Teams org-wide configuration. And then you can also provide the ability for some feature set within directly to the user perspective. So you can define certain things like who can create teams, what features they can use, et cetera, and then also from an org-wide perspective. Right? And then from a management side of things, you go to a few different areas in Office 365. As you know, Microsoft Teams utilizes a lot of the Office 365 stack. So, you'll require access to, the Skype for Business or and Teams Admin Center, the Azure AD Admin Center, and it utilizes the, Microsoft Teams and Skype PowerShell modules, in addition to Graph APIs as well. So those are some of the different management tools that you can utilize. So and so, Dinas, why don't you lead us down into sort of what the messaging policies are like, and what you can do there?
Yeah, so thanks, Hab. There's four areas you'll want to familiarize yourself in terms of governance with respect to messaging and meetings and Teams. And those are the messaging policies, there's meeting settings, meeting policies, and then lastly, live event policies. So in terms of messaging policies, this is where you're going to be able to go and apply governance on things like whether owners can delete sent messages, which is often, critical. You'll want to be able to control the content there. Whether a user can edit their own sent messages, you send a message, you want to be able to make an update. Things like read receipts, chat, whether Giphies could be used in your Teams. The content rating on Giphies, you can actually set content ratings between like strict, moderate, and no restriction. The use of memes, stickers, URL previews, and even allowing users to translate messages within Teams as well. So that's the first one, messaging policies. Secondly, we've got meeting settings. And here's where you're going to be able to control things like whether an anonymous user can join a team, can join a meeting, basically toggle that on or off. Similar in the Skype world, we have the ability to do the logo URLs, legal and help URLs. Those are something you'd be familiar with from the Skype world. Footers within a message as well. And then they also throw in the network configuration there, and this is something new. Things like QoS, whether you're going to be able to tag packets on your local network for QoS. the port ranges you're going to want to be able to use for audio, video, and screen sharing. So they're set at default of 20 ports, but you can actually customize the range so that you can prioritize that traffic appropriately for your network. In terms of meeting policies, this is where you would configure, settings, the actual settings for meetings themselves, in terms of allowing users to do a meet now, the Outlook add-in, be able to control whether that appears or not, channel scheduling, private meeting scheduling, things like audio transcription, cloud recording, IP video, that type of thing. Whether in terms of content sharing, what people are able to share in the meeting, how you can give or request control for meetings, PowerPoint, whiteboard, shared notes, those type of things you'll be able to control in here. And lastly, participants and guests. So whether you allow anonymous users to start meetings, and whether you allow automatically admit users into meetings that are scheduled. And lastly, with live event policies, effectively here you're basically controlling whether you allow live meetings or not, the scheduling of them. And this is the one-to-many type broadcasting, formerly known as Skype meeting broadcast. Transcription for attendees is something new that's just been dropped in, so you can transcribe the content of the speaker into many different languages. Who can join the scheduled live meetings, and the recording settings for the live meetings as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael, and he's going to talk about external access and guest access.
Yeah, so if you're you're thinking about governance around communication, you'll need to think about external access. And if you're familiar with the Skype for Business side of the house, this is really federation. So that's the ability for your business users to communicate with those with users outside of your organization. And so you have some controls in this Microsoft Teams and Skype for Business Admin Center, where you can control maybe which domains are your users are able to communicate to. You can turn off federation or external access altogether. There isn't the ability for groups of users to restrict what domains those certain groups of users can do. So there's no ethical walls yet built into the product, but there's third parties that are building those tools. So you have to think about, that those communication channels, voice, video, instant messaging. We'll see some improvements in federation with Teams, and we might start seeing, the ability to share tabs and apps and GIFs. So we'll Microsoft's always improving Teams. So it'll be interesting to see where they take federation and external communication. And then on the other side, you have guest access, and this was pre the ability for Teams to do federation and external access. And guest access is the ability to invite someone outside your organization to take part in your Teams. And so they actually end up creating an account within your tenant, your Azure Active Directory, and they're a member of that team. So that means they have access to all the channels under that team. And so you have to think about the governance around now you have these entities that are outside your organization. They're in your Azure AD as a guest, but now they might be able to, or they now can consume the data and conversations in those teams. So you have to think about, if there's confidential information, or maybe there's some private information that external orgs should not see. Then maybe those are the teams and channel or teams that you would restrict guest access for being allowed to be added. So around that whole governance around teams, naming conventions, and who's members, who can create teams. You'll also want to be able to control who can invite guests to those teams and which teams actually allow for guests. And that can be controlled from the admin center and Azure Active Directory.
Yeah, so in adding on top of that, with regards to the creation of teams, you really have about 3 different options from that perspective, right? So you have the always on, so any user that is a member of Teams can create a team and become an owner of it. The other option is it's controlled by the IT department. And then you can also assign a security group, which is done through Azure Active Directory and security groups, but you need an Azure AD P1 license for that. From that perspective, and there's a subset of PowerShell commandlets that you can run that we covered in a previous podcast. We discussed that side of things. In addition, there's another functionality which you need an Azure, I think is a P2 license for, which is for the expiration policies. And what that will allow you to do is you can set sort of when the sunset portion of the team is done. So the team is usually initiate, active, and then sunset. So when the team is sort of out near the end, or you want to know if the team is actually active, you can specify expiration policies in which the owner of the team will get an email saying like, hey, is this team still active? Do you want to extend it for X amount of period of time? And if it doesn't, then it will then be archived, I think by default for 90 days and then removed after that, or fit in within the retention policy, right? And then there's the naming policies that you can add during the creation of the teams as well. And that's for entering in specific keywords that you don't want users to create a team. So you can enter the keywords like HR or CIO or CEO or anything like that, and will restrict the users from creating teams with those particular names, right? So because they should be utilized for their department function, et cetera. So with that, I'll push it over to Curtis for some data retention.
Cool. Thanks, Habib. Hey, Habib, on the naming policy, I think that's an Azure AD Premium license too, right? Yeah. Yeah. So once you set up access to teams and access to features within teams, another big piece you'll want to think about is data retention. So if your organization needs to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, you need to keep data around certain types of data for 7 years. So in Office 365 in the security and compliance portal, you can actually go in and choose teams as a data retention location. And when we talk about teams data is stored in teams in a number of different areas. Two of the biggest areas needed for governance are the chat messages, one-to-one or one-to-many, and then the messages that appear in the channels inside the teams. So both of those types of data are available as different locations to retain data or to delete it. So if you have a legal requirement to delete data after 1 year, for example, you can go in and set a retention policy to delete both types of that data. Some other things you'll want to think about too is all the files, the content inside of a Teams channel is stored in the associated SharePoint site library. You can go in to the security and compliance portal and set a retention policy on those SharePoint site libraries as well. Yeah, so it's a fairly rich feature set. You can go in and again configure, if you need to delete data in a certain period of time or retain data for a certain period of time. So really, once you go in and configure that to meet your organizational requirements, you're good from a data retention standpoint. And it's probably worth pointing out another big feature around data is the ability to classify it. And Office 365 has the capability to classify Exchange Online data and some of the other workloads. That labeling capability, labeling certain types of data, the classification of it, it's not available for Teams today in terms of the chat and channel messages, but I believe that's coming. So that's about it from a data retention perspective. Habib, we were talking before, when you think about Teams governance too, you really want to think of Teams as a life cycle. Do you want to just quickly explain that?
Yeah, as sort of I touched on it in the previous section there, that usually it's the initiation part of it. It's a 3-part process, potentially a 4 if you add the extend section in there. But it's the initiation of the team. It's when the team is active, and then there's the sunset, which is when the team is going to be expiring if it's utilized for a specific function or a project. And then you obviously you have the option to extend that team life cycle for a little bit longer in the event that you need it, right? So I think that's generally it's sort of like that 3-part, 4-part cycle.
Yeah, and I guess that's important because usually typically create a team for a specific purpose. And, once that project or that purpose has outlived its life, then you'll want to clean up the data and clean up the team. So something to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome, guys. Great discussion, great information here. So hopefully everybody listening in will have a better understanding of what's required or what you can do from a team's governance perspective. And thanks for an awesome talk. And hopefully everyone will catch you on the next episode.
See ya.